He's going to, and then I'm
No, we're going to, instead of a
talk
question,
among yourselves.
Just talk to people individually over the book signing and afterwards, too.
Sure, sounds great.
Oh, after I start speaking, would you just,
Okay.
thank you.
Is this volume okay for everyone? Okay. Good evening. Welcome to Rockefeller. My name is Thomas Flynn. I'm the events coordinator for the Seminary Co-op bookstores. We're very pleased to have you here with us this evening. A few notes before we get started. Books are for sale over in the corner there, all tucked away. Right next to that is a small table where Jonathan Kozol will be signing afterwards. There will be no question and answer period, but he'll be more than happy to chat as he signs books. This evening, he will only be signing copies of Letters to a Young Teacher. So with that, I'd like to introduce our introducer, Bill Ayers.
Thanks, Thomas. Thank you. Thank you, Thomas. Before I introduce Jonathan, I would like to say that 57th Street Bookstore, which is sponsoring this event, is a very special institution in Chicago. When nobody else has the nerve to do things that need to be done, 57th Street Books does them. So I urge you not only to buy one of Jonathan's books tonight, but to go over to 57th Street Bookstore and support them. Some of you know that the debate about the Mearsheimer-Walt book. They are sponsoring that book in a couple of weeks. So keep an eye on this bookstore and support independent intellectual life in Chicago, not just tonight, but throughout. Jonathan Kozol. You know him. He's one of you. You've read his words, angry, loving words, and you know he's telling a truth beyond the cliches of politicians and policy people. He's a long-distance runner, an intrepid and gentle warrior for justice. What more is there to say? When Jonathan was here 2 years ago, I recalled meeting him in the mid-1960s. He just published Death at an Early Age, his riveting account of teaching fourth grade in a Boston public school. And I was a new kindergarten teacher in search of encouragement and advice, like the teacher he addresses in this current book. So I'd called him on the telephone. We'd never met, but Jonathan was, as always, gracious and generous, and we sat down later that day for a talk. I remember being surprised at the overwhelming reception his book was getting, and we laughed together about the constant references by the critics to his youthful idealism. I think they can hardly wait for me to grow up, he said to me that day, or to drop dead. The good news is that he's still here, that he's with us again tonight with his hope and idealism intact, and yes, his anger too, and that he's still speaking the unwelcome truth to power, still comforting the afflicted while afflicting the comfortable, still refusing the detached stance of the educational researcher or the cool pose of the cynic, insisting that if we open our eyes and wake up, we still might change the world for ourselves no less than for our children. Death at an Early Age went on to win the National Book Award, and more importantly, to galvanize a movement for full civil and human rights in the cities of the North. And he didn't stop. He wrote and he spoke and he acted, book after book. His laser-like examination of the class and racial fault lines haunting American democracy served as a kind of atlas from the classroom to the larger society and added a new phrase to the American vocabulary, savage inequalities. And 2 years ago, The Shame of the Nation, in which Jonathan reminded us that while many have implicitly settled for the obscene logic of separate but equal, the new apartheid, the promise of Brown versus Board of Education was always a moral promise, an affirmation of the full humanity of black people, of all people, and the requirement that everyone in a democracy be granted equal education, equal opportunity, equal respect and recognition and dignity. The right to an education is a fundamental human right. And now comes Letters to a Young Teacher, a passionate and respectful defense of the art and the beauty of teaching, and a refusal to bow before the forces of dehumanization that are everywhere on the rise in this distinctly ungenerous time. Here is Jonathan Kozol as a practicing and very public ethicist. This is the heart of the matter. He asks each of us to look beyond personal virtue, things like be honest and do your work and be on time, all good things to be sure, but things that are as desirable in an authoritarian society as they are in a democracy. Jonathan asks us to consider community ethics, how we behave collectively, how our society behaves, how the contexts of politics and economics, for example, interact with what we hold to be ethical. Most of us, after all, most of the time, follow the conventions of our culture. Most Spartans act like Spartans. Most Athenians act like Athenians. And for good or not, most Americans act like Americans. Kozol alerts us to the immorality of our common sense, all the injustices, large and small, that we merely take for granted. And he asks us to take action on whatever the known demands. Rosa Luxemburg, the German revolutionary jailed for opposing World War I, wrote to a friend from prison, urging him, she said, to be a mensch, a Yiddish word meaning acting for the good. But she went on, a mensch is someone who loves her life enough to celebrate the sunrise and the sunset, to admire the shape of the clouds, to enjoy a meal, to invest in friends and family. But a mensch is also someone willing to put her shoulder on history's wheel when history demands it. JonathanKozol, revolutionary thinker, idealist, public ethicist, and mensch among men. Thank you for joining us. Jonathan.
You're a mensch. Especially on Dr. Kennedy. Yeah, I love that. Thank you.
Hope it works without that gadget that was there. Thank you, Bill. You can see why Bill's such a wonderful writer. That eloquence. And thanks, too, to Mike Klonsky. Where are you, Mike? Yeah, and his super smart and gutsy daughters. Glad you're here. And Jack Wiest and all my other allies and close friends from Chicago. And thanks to each and every one of you, new friends, for being here tonight as well. I always ask this before I start. How many real live teachers are there in this room with us tonight? Hooray, look at that. And how many administrators who have been teachers or started out as teachers? Yes? Or people who are thinking of becoming teachers? Good. I always feel safer when I'm in a room with teachers. I think most of you know that I feel very close to teachers in the public schools. Especially, I have to admit, the ones who work with little children in the elementary grades, because those are the grades I used to teach. I just think they do the best thing there is to do in life. Bring joy and beauty, mystery and mischief to the hearts of little pint-sized people. I hope they never lose that mischievous quality. Sometimes when I'm visiting a school here in Chicago or New York or anywhere else, teachers will see me in the corridor and they'll come right up to me as if we know each other already. Well, sometimes we do. Sometimes I recruited them when they were in college. And they never forgive me for that. And they'll come right up and they'll say, come on and visit in my classroom. And sometimes they don't give me any choice. They grab me by the arm and drag me down the corridor into their class, like a first grade class. And then when we get there, they typically put me on the spot. And they'll say, okay, teach something. You write the books. Let's see if you still remember how to do it. And I typically do it wrong, because I forget. Now, what I usually do wrong is I ask that kind of question that gets everybody jumping out of their chairs at the same time. As you know, if you've worked with little kids, this is not uncommon in first grade. little kids that age, as one of my favorite teachers likes to say, have only a theoretical connection with their chairs. So they defy the laws of gravity in order to get your attention. And typically there's one real close to me, a little girl in the front row, a demonic little girl who's waving her fingers in my face as though she's gonna poke my eyes out if I won't call on her, and making the most heart-rending sounds. Ooh, 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 as though she's going to die if I won't call on her. And I don't want this little girl to die, so I call on her, and typically she looks right up at me with sweet bewilderment, and she says, "What?" She didn't have a single thing to say. She just wanted me to recognize that she was there. You know, it's a humbling experience for a guy like me who writes books to go back into the classroom, as I do again and again, and spend a couple hours or a morning or a day doing the work that teachers do day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. I sometimes think that every education writer and every so-called education expert in the nation's capital, and every one of those grim accountability technicians, and every one of those specialists in AYP, and every one of those patronizing politicians who speak so condescendingly and disrespectfully of teachers in the public schools, including Mr. Bush, ought to be obliged to come into the classroom once a year and teach that class, not for an hour with the TV cameras watching, but for the entire day, and find out what it's really like to be a teacher in the front lines of our public schools, because it's all too easy to forget. I want you to know, and I'm sure you can tell from my voice, that my heart is very heavy nowadays. On June 28th, the Supreme Court of the United States, in a devastating blow to almost everything I've lived for, virtually reversed Brown versus Board of Education, prohibiting not only state-mandated programs of school integration, but even voluntary programs. Our schools are now more segregated than they were at any time since 1968, the year that Dr. King was taken from us. In cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, New York City, especially the South Bronx, where I spent a lot of time, black kids grow up and never know white children. In the typical inner city school I visit, it's not just that there aren't a lot of white kids, there's usually no white children. In a big high school of 4,000 that I visited not long ago, there were 6 white children. And one of them had spiked green hair. I think that's what they mean by other. So, now the Supreme Court decision has hammered the final nail into the dream of Dr. King and all those who put their bodies on the line
beside him. I'm old enough, so I remember listening to Dr. King. Black parents in Boston, where I began to teach, were very loyal to me. I often tell this to young white teachers who wonder, will I be accepted in a black community? Well, it depends on what you do. In my case, I kind of stumbled into their loyalty by accident. One day, frustrated by the virtually all-white middle-class curriculum, I picked up a book of poetry by Langston Hughes and brought it into class and read one poem from that book to my children, almost all of whom were black. And the children, of course, reacted in an electric way, in a beautiful way. Children who had been unresponsive to me up till then. One little girl in particular who used to sit in the back row and glare at me all year long. Just couldn't trust white people for good reason. She had this beautiful chiseled face, but this look of indomitable anger in her eyes. At that moment when I read the poem from Langston Hughes, she got up out of her chair. And you know the kids who insist on sitting in the back row? She was one of them. And she walked around the whole class and came up to the front of the room and touched me on my shoulder and stroked me gently on my shoulder and whispered, "Thank you." And then she asked if she could bring the book home and show it to her mother. I was so happy, I would have given her my car if she asked for it. And she came in the next day, and she recited the whole poem from memory. What happens to a dream deferred? You know that poem, I'm sure. And the next day I was fired from the Boston Public Schools. Because just like now, they had these standards and lists of proficiencies for each grade level, and little mini chunks of amputated knowledge. You know what I mean? Standards. And the anger of Langston Hughes wasn't in the standards. So I was fired for curriculum deviation. That was the charge. You know, white folks, I'd gone to Harvard, white folks with good degrees don't suffer very long. Fired for curriculum deviation, I was hired a month later by the federal government for curriculum development. But the black community was grateful for that act that I'd sort of done almost by mistake, it was an accident. So when Dr. King came to preach in Boston, they asked me if I would be a bodyguard for him. Look at me. I never forgot that, being so close to him and hearing his words. And I'm a stubborn guy, and I still believe that he was right. So this Supreme Court decision broke my heart. And the refusal of my party, the Democratic Party, Democratic leaders to take any initiative to counteract that ruling, which they could, broke my heart even more. So a few days later, on the 4th of July, I began to fast as my private sense of protest and repentance. It's a partial fast. Obviously, I wouldn't still be alive, because that was more than 2 months ago. I still take some food, mostly liquid, at my doctor's insistence, because he wants me to avert the risk of long-term damage to my heart. But if I seem a little frail to you tonight, that's the reason why.
But my new book, Letters to a Young Teacher, is a happy book. It's cheerful. And it's cheerful because it's an invitation to what I think is a beautiful profession. It's a year of letters that I wrote to a first grade teacher in an inner city school who wrote to me, as lots of you do, lots of teachers do, when they're starting out, and asked if I'd visit in her classroom. And then as soon as I arrived, as soon as I got there, she put me to work and made me work with her children, made me teach consonant blends. Do you know what they are? They're very important things. See, I'm not afraid of phonics. No consonant blend can scare me. I mean, some of the conservatives in Washington, the NCLB fanatics, the standardistas, they always accuse us who dissent of being afraid of phonics. And that's not so. I just believe in teaching phonics out of the words that children care about, words they introduce to us. And the truth is, there are some, I hate to say this, and I don't want to insult anyone in Chicago, but there are some lunatics in the phonics movement. A lot of crazy people are attracted to phonics, like they think it's the answer to every ill on earth. There's a woman in Phoenix, Arizona, who says she's a fan of mine, but follows me every time I speak in Arizona. And no matter what I talk about, once I was speaking about the homeless children in Tucson, she sits in the front row, and at the end of my talk, she comes up and she grabs me by the elbow. I don't know why, but she always squeezes this elbow. Must be a vulnerable spot. And she looks at me with this look in her eye, a clinically suspicious look, and she whispers, phonics. You know, I call her the fanatic of Phoenix. There are a lot of screwballs like that in Washington right now. But, you know, I'd make mistakes when I visited Francesca's class, and she had this lovely irreverence, so she put me in my place. If I did one day early on, she asked me to suggest a short sentence for the children, a short sentence of nonfiction, okay? And I didn't pay attention. And I gave a long sentence about animals who talk, which she insisted was not nonfiction, though I would argue with her about that later on. And so right in front of the children, the kids called me Mr. Jonathan because they couldn't pronounce my last name. She said, Mr. Jonathan has not acted like a grown-up. What should we do to him? And they voted I needed a timeout. And they made me go and sit in the corner on the reading rug and hold a teddy bear. I came to love that classroom, and I kept visiting for an entire year, watching the teacher, whom I call Francesca, achieved marvelous gains with her children, even though she never taught a test prep lesson all year long. She refused to drill her 6-year-olds to artificially inflate their scores on an exam, but filled her room with her own contagious sense of jubilation in the act of learning and the company of children, teaching the children phonics from the words of stories that they told her, and from words that stirred their curiosity in children's books that she flooded into the room. Books, wonderful books like The Very, 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 Very Hungry Caterpillar by Eric Carle. I'm so happy. About 3 months ago, he saw an early copy of my new book. And I picked up the phone one day, and it was Eric Carle on the telephone. How many of you know his books? Yes. Wouldn't you be excited? That meant more to me, I can assure you, than any phone call from the President of the United States. Any president, except maybe FDR, but he's not likely to call. And she also read them grown-up poems, not just the standard black lit that people feel they have to do as a token gesture. You know, nowadays it's always Langston Hughes. But Paula Lawrence Dunbar and the other great poets of the Harlem Renaissance and new, exciting black and Hispanic poets, and the tough poetry of Gwendolyn Brooks. And she also read them because she was wonderfully educated, as many of you are, in the liberal arts. Although she was certified and well prepared as a teacher, she also read them European poetry, William Butler Yeats, and sonnets by the German poet Rilke, which the children loved. They couldn't read them themselves, but they'd pick a word out of one of these poems that fascinated them. And then they'd ask her how to spell it. And she wasn't afraid of teaching them big words. She taught her class how to spell persnickety. That's a big word, because one little girl said her grandma always used that word, persnickety, when she was grouchy. And the little girl wanted to know what it meant. There's a consonant blend in persnickety. And one child asked her what the word bamboozle means. And she impertinently said, "Oh, that's what you do to me every morning." And she taught them how to spell that word too. And in the end, her kids did very well on their exams. And she endeared herself to her principal. She was smart. She didn't demonize her principal, even though her principal had to enforce all these rules coming down from Washington, because she knew her principal was under the sword. And she knew her principal secretly appreciated her mischievous qualities. And she did a good job. I always say to young teachers who are going to be rebels, if you want to defend yourself, the best defense is to be really good at what you do. You got to teach those skills. And you got to keep sensible control. You know, in a school, it's had a lot of chaos. A teacher who can keep a pleasant degree of calm in her classroom becomes absolutely inexpendable. They're not going to fire you. When I was a young teacher, after I started causing problems, I asked the class one day how they could protect me. This was earlier in the year when I was causing littler problems. And I said, what matters most to the authorities in this school? And every one of them said, filing quietly in the hallways. So I said, okay, here's how you can protect me when we go out in the hallways. Just be like little soldiers, okay? And they played ball with me. And the principal, who was very suspicious of me, came into the classroom the following week and said, "Mr. Kozol, I have a compliment for your children. Everybody in the building is talking about the way they file in the hallway." As soon as she left, all the kids held up little V's for victory. Francesca
also rebelled against something many of you may hear. There are those who tell us that black kids and Latino kids, but blacks especially, are so different from white children that they need a totally different method of instruction. Proto-military, absolute uniformity. Have you ever heard that? They need it, we're told. Not enough discipline in their lives. Methods, frankly, that would be rejected out of hand in any good suburban school. A lot of these schools, I find, are also flooded with business-driven slogans nowadays. Have you noticed this? How many of you are teachers again? No. Well, you don't see this much in the suburbs because suburban parents wouldn't like it. But I see it in the inner city schools. It's as though society has decided that these inner city kids are to be trained for useful roles in the lower levels of the economy. So you see, I see these signs, like I saw a mission statement in one kindergarten,
which said, the mission of our school is to turn young people into products, the word products, in kindergarten, who will sharpen our nation's competitive edge in global markets. That was in kindergarten. But Francesca later said, why should these little babies care about the global marketplace, for God's sake? She said, they care about belly buttons, itchy elbows, woolly caterpillars.
And then she said something wonderful. She said, I refuse to steal away their childhood. And when I told her, well, some experts say black kids learn totally differently from everybody else, she answered bravely, I refuse to treat them as a different species. You give them the same good opportunities you and I received, and these kids will blossom like the flowers that they are. Well, there are thousands of glorious Francescas in this nation, hundreds of thousands of them coming into our public schools. I meet them everywhere I go. But 50% of these new young teachers, at least the ones in urban schools, are quitting their jobs right now within 3 years. When I ask them why they're leaving, virtually every single time, the first answer that I hear is this dreadful testing mania that's being forced upon us by No Child Left Behind. They tell me that they hate this law because unless they have defiant spirits or a defiant principle to defend them, it forces them to steal at least a quarter of the year, usually more like half the year, away from education in order to do robotic and mindless drilling for exams. Strategies for taking tests, not content and not culture. Second, they tell me that these high-stakes standardized exams are useless since the results come back so late. Did you know that? How many of you know? Just nod if you know what I mean. Like, in case you don't know, you live in Illinois, but I know this about Illinois. Because I talked to the statewide union, the Illinois Education Association, recently, and they told me this. The tests given 2 years ago in March, the standardized exams, the NCLB exams, I call them, they get sent away to be scored by some company like McGraw-Hill or Harcourt. It's now a $3 billion industry since NCLB, by the way. Money taken from the public schools, taken from other needs. The scores didn't come back till the following March. In New York, last year, the March tests, scores didn't come back till the following September. Most schools, they don't come back till July. Now, when President Bush was trying to sell this to Congress 5-6 years ago, he said, all we want to do is help young Miss O'Brien. If it's New York, let's say young Miss Levine. I'm Jewish. I have to get a plug-in for Miss Levine. He said, all we want to do is help this young teacher identify where little Susie's or Shaniqua's weaknesses may lie, so she can give that child extra help where she needs it. I cannot figure out. I've been trying all these years. I can't figure out what planet Mr. Bush lives on. Probably that odd one far away that they recently decided isn't a real planet. You know, selling a fraud like that to the public. The test is going to help little Shaniqua. What's Miss O'Brien supposed to do? Send a postcard to Shaniqua in the middle of the summer? Truth of the matter is, I don't believe that NCLB and the tests that it demands were ever honestly intended by the people who designed it in the right-wing think tanks in the White House, were ever seriously intended to improve our education system. I believe it was created as a shaming ritual in order to discredit the entire concept of the public school itself by holding up impossible demands without the funds to pay for them, and by this means to pave the way for privatizing firms and vouchers. That's my real belief. Even worse is the distortion of curriculum because of the tight timing in the classroom, because frightened principals, the principals are very honest. They'll say to me, Jonathan, I am making my teachers do things I abhor because they're so scared of being humiliated in the press and having their school taken over as the ultimate punishment and handed over to a private company. Did you know that's like penalty 5 under NCLB? So as a result, a lot of them are forcing teachers to hold timers in their hands so that every minute of the school day is devoted to a specific item that's going to appear on the state exam. And this also guarantees that a wonderful, luminous young teacher won't make the terrible mistake of saying something that she thought of on her own, which would undermine the whole routine. Because people come around to check on you. How many of you have noticed that? Yes, in New York, the teachers call them the curriculum cops. They want to know, what proficiency are you teaching at this minute of the day? And you're supposed to write it on the board. Do you have to do that in Chicago? Yeah, you have to write it in New York. You have to write the state standard in the words of the standards. You can't put it into child-friendly language on the board, and you have to put a number next to it. Do you ever have to do that here? You have to put the number of the standard. Like, you have to write, like, English Language Arts, standard number 28B. Children will demonstrate proficiency in something or other, you see. And I see the word proficiency up there also. Why put the word proficiency up on the wall? Any fourth grader who walked out of class and said to one of his friends, hey, I learned a proficiency today, would probably get punched in the nose. Proficiency is a typical example of a pretentious word that the standards writers love.
They think the more syllables in the word, the higher level of intellect they achieve. So, they won't say, you can use this idea in the classroom. They say, utilize. You can't copy something. No, replicate. You can't even do it. No, implement.
When I was a student at Harvard, I was fortunate to study 2 years with a wonderful poet named Archibald MacLeish. Any of you old enough to remember him? And he once said to me, Jonathan, every single time you find that you're using a big, fancy, Latinate, polysyllabic word to say something you could have said in simple terms, be suspicious of your motives. So you take a good old-fashioned Anglo-Saxon word like skill, add 3 syllables, call it a proficiency. And these standards experts will melt into a pool of butter that you're willing to be as pretentious as they are. I always say to teachers, don't talk that way. Use your own words. Speak in your own voice. Defend your own authenticity. Don't let them take your natural soul away from you. But the worst thing about this is that when everything's tightly timed, you're afraid to let a child get you off track. And little kids love to get you off track. As every teacher of youngsters knows, 6-year-olds particularly are gifted artists at subverting lesson plans. That's one of the entitlements God gave them. I don't know if that's in the Episcopal liturgy, but Lutherans believe that. I was just in a Lutheran college. I always like quoting Christian denominations since I'm Jewish, And I love to preach in Christian churches, especially the National Cathedral in Washington, because that's where all the politicians go to pray. As a Jew, I just take limitless joy in quoting the words of Jesus to delinquent Christians, And there are so many of them in Washington. But some little kid, let's say it's a little boy, raises his hand, and you got your outcome up there on the wall. You're trying to obey the rules so you won't get in trouble. And he says, teacher, and you think maybe he's going to help me achieve my outcome. So you make the mistake of saying, what? And he says, guess what? Because children never tell you anything. You have to guess. She says, what? And he says, I went to the zoo yesterday with my Uncle Pookie. I know a little boy who has an Uncle Pookie. I actually met Uncle Pookie once. He was a very nice man. He sounded like his name was Pookie, too. He was sweet. And he said, I went to the zoo with my Uncle Pookie. And guess what? Oh, she has to say what again? And he says, and I saw a baby bear that had just been born. And then he starts piling on the ands and buts for one of those endless run-on sentences at which little children are almost as good as William Faulkner. And sometimes if you listen, at the end of all those ands and buts, there's a piece of hidden treasure where the child says something you never knew about him before, which he unveils, something deep and secret in his soul. And great teachers use that piece of hidden treasure to unlock motivation. But in these fear-driven, test-driven inner-city schools, the teacher has to cut him off and never gets to find that treasure. He will never know what lies within that child's heart. Unless the teacher has the courage to resist these practices. as Francesca did. And that's one reason why I wrote this book, as kind of a handbook for young teachers, in order to rebel against things they find abhorrent, but also to survive. Perhaps what a lot of good young teachers hate the most is that the testing nightmare starts so early. NCLB requires that it start in third grade, but in lots of schools you'll find principals start giving these high-stakes tests in kindergarten, bubble tests, first grade or kindergarten, to get the kids ready for the exams. So you have little kids in kindergarten, unless they've been to preschool, and most of the poorest kids have not, coming into school, to kindergarten, and they don't know sometimes the text goes from left to right. Did you know that? You have to visit kindergarten in September to find that out. And often they don't know how to hold a pencil or manipulate a crayon. And they look at these tests and they pee in their pants. They start to cry, they throw up. I sometimes wonder who thinks up these miseries for children. Sometimes I think there's a group of sociopaths in Washington, in a little room somewhere, unhappy people, down in the basement of the Heritage Foundation, plotting how they can make little kids as miserable as they are. If at least these kids got pre-K, good pre-K education, they might have a chance of passing these exams. But in the majority of inner-city schools I visit, no matter what claims the state and city make, which are almost never to be believed, I find that only a tiny handful of the kids have had any of the rich developmental preschool that middle-class people take for granted nowadays. You know how to find out? You ask the kindergarten teacher. She knows by the third week of the year, maybe by the third day of the year, which kids got pre-K and which kids didn't. And typically, whether it's in Chicago or Seattle or Los Angeles or Denver, wherever I go, the teacher will take me by the arm and she'll look around the room. And in many of these cities, maybe not Chicago, if I say anything bad, it doesn't apply to Chicago. Everywhere else in America. She says to me, of these 28 kids, yes, kindergartens with 28 kids, she'll say, maybe 6 or 7 of them got something you'd consider real pre-K, the sort of thing rich people get. And meanwhile, wealthy people, and I still know rich people, in New York, rich people still invite me to dinner. They're always nervous that I'm going to ruin the dinner party, and I do my best to do so. Because they secretly think I want to redistribute their wealth, which I do. But they invite me and they tell me what they do with their kids, and I know you can't fool me because I know. Typically, they put their kids into these wonderful preschool programs like Montessori when they're only 2.5 years old, 3 at the latest. And these are expensive programs, too. In New York, the top ones now cost $24,000 a year. Any of you know New York? Up in Riverdale. $24,000 a year. For a 2.5-year-old. There's a little, how big is a 2.5-year-old? I always think, how much is that per pound? And then most of them send their kids to public school if they can get them into one of the boutique schools. You know what I mean by that? One of those schools that mysteriously get dominated by children of the wealthy. And suddenly in third grade, they all have to take the same exams. Which ones do you think score highest and get labeled gifted and talented? The first step in that long progression that leads inevitably to honors and AP. And which ones do you think get labeled developmentally delayed, retarded, socially delayed, and are likely not to be promoted? To me, I think it's especially outrageous to impose so many high-stakes tests on children in the earliest grades of school if we have first denied them any opportunity for preschool. There's something deeply hypocritical in a society that holds a child 8 years old or 9 years old accountable. That's the buzzword, isn't it, these days? Accountable for her proficiency on a high-stakes standardized exam, but doesn't hold the president and Congress accountable for robbing her of what they gave their own kids 7 years before. I've told many members of the Senate that if they have the Democrats, because the Republicans don't tend to chat with me, I spent a couple of weeks in Washington talking with virtually every Democrat on the Education Committee that's about to debate NCLB. And I said, you ought to write into that bill an amendment that no high-stakes test given to any child in the third grade of public school can be used to judge or penalize a child, school, or teacher till the state certifies that every one of those third graders previously received 3 years of rich developmental preschool on the same level as the children of the privileged. And you'd be surprised how many of the Democratic senators agreed with me on this. But we shall see what they do when it comes to a vote. I pointed out to them that they could quadruple the number of children served by Head Start for the price of 2 months of the Iraqi war. 2 months of that war. Meanwhile, the tests are there. So in my book, I try my best to give survival strategies, and I won't go into them all because you're not all teachers. But I will say, just in the long run, I think one of the things that saved Francesca's soul and enabled her to prevail and not get fired and win over her principal's loyalty and at the same time not forfeit her own incandescent, lovely personality, which is what her kids adored. I think one of the things that saved her was
that she had this sense of sly irreverence, a sly, subversive quality in the face of some of the absurdities imposed by NCLB and the state in which she was teaching. For example, she would never put that number of the standard on the board, like, 56B, homonyms or something.
She said to me, no child's ever going to come back in 20 years and say, Miss Francesca, I can't tell you how grateful I am to you for teaching me 26B. She said, that's not for the children, it's to cover my rear end. She said, I refuse to do it.
She had an unshakable sense of humor and a lovely playfulness that she picked up from her children, which may be one reason they adored her. I strongly recommend a good big dose of sly irreverence to every teacher in our public schools. I'm going to make one last point before I end.
maybe 1.5 points. The other day I was given a chance to ask a question, to pose the education question for the next presidential debate, which is going to be online on AOL and Huffington Post. You know what that is? And so they sent a camera crew up to Boston for me to ask the education question. They said, you can only ask one question. So I asked 3. But you have to sneak it in.
In the final event, nothing that the technocrats in Washington have now imposed, not the standards, not the tests, not the threats, not the sanctions, not the AYPs, none of that counts 1/10 as much in the success or failure of a school as the quality of the teachers, the high unbroken spirit of the teachers, and the number of children in the classroom that the teacher serves. Now, there are people in Washington who tell you class size doesn't matter. The president has said that. Pat Buchanan once yelled at me when I said class size does count quite a bit. Because, you know, I walk into classes all the time, including Chicago. But I'm thinking now of New York, an 11th grade lab course. It was supposed to be a chemistry lab course with 38 in the room. In LA, I walked into a 10th grade government class with 40 in the room, taught by a wonderful young teacher. I said to her, how the hell do you teach 40 kids? Don't ever ask that question. She said, here, find out. Handed me the class. I say this on TV all the time. I say, 40 kids in a class. You know, what the conservatives will say is, well, if this teacher just tries hard enough, if she obeys the standards, if we hold her accountable, if we measure her constantly, if we give enough exams to assess her children, she can do an okay job with 40 children. And I always say, yes, that's true. If she's the Wizard of Oz, you know, she's a magician, she can do an okay job with 40 children, but a teacher who can do an okay job with 40 children can work miracles with 20 children. Everybody knows, because she's got twice as much time for every little belly button in that room. Pat Buchanan, no less than he, that symbol, the very avatar of Renaissance man, once yelled at me on television, on CNN, because I have to do these things. Bill does sometimes too. But, you know, every TV show needs one liberal. So if the other 6 happen to be ill that day, they call me. And he yelled at me and he said, that stuff about class size is nonsense. He said, when I was a kid, I went to a school that had 50 children in the class, and we didn't have any pretty rugs on the floor or any beautiful children's books. We used old-fashioned primers, and we didn't have any fancy software, he said. Of course, when he was a little boy, there were no computers. And then he said, and if you disobeyed, and he said this with what I thought was clinically suspicious glee. He said, if you disobeyed, the nuns whipped you. He said that gleefully. And then he said, didn't do me any harm. You know? I wanted to say, I don't know, Pat. Maybe that's why you're so mean. There's a lovely line in the poet W.H. Auden. Beautiful line. A lot of teachers love it. When will we ever know what all school children learn? Those to whom evil is done do evil in return. I think a lot of those Heritage Foundation types must have had terrible childhoods. I sometimes think we should let loose about 500 golden retrievers in the Heritage Foundation, just to soften them up. But let me tell you something. I visit good suburban schools, like Glencoe and Winnetka, only in my case, in Boston, it's Brookline and Newton. How many have ever heard of those towns? You know, where Jewish people live, and psychiatrists. Lots of psychiatrists, so lots of crazy children. I'm the son of a psychiatrist. I can testify to that dilemma. Those schools typically have 16 children in third grade. 18 is a lot. At the fancy prep schools in New England, where the really rich people send their kids, Andover, for example. Have you ever heard of that school? How many have ever heard of Andover?
I live just 20 minutes from Andover.